What is going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of The Cutting Board. This video is slightly longer than ones that I'm used to making, so we're just going to get right to it. Today I'm going to take you through how I designed, stacked, laminated, and power carved this lysine table inspired by Caleb at Caleb Woodard Furniture. So let's get right to it. So to start off, I wanted to get a sense of what size I wanted to make my table, and I recruited a bit of help for it. Now, this specific type of project does have a sizing threshold, but I'll get more into that later. So once I had my dimensions set, the next step was to work backwards from that rough height, width, and depth to figure out both the design for this project and from that the amount of material I would need. Since this build was essentially a three-dimensional cutting board with hollow spaces throughout it, I could take my chosen length and width, or in this case my X and Y axis, and start mapping out what I wanted the side profiles to look like. I then could add a third dimension to the project, or a Z-axis, that would help me determine how to go about creating the design of the depth I wanted. Since I wanted my project to be 15 inches deep, I chose to divide my project into 5 slices, where each slice would be a two-dimensional design along the X and Y axis that was 3 inches deep, that when laminated together one after another would form a three-dimensional shape along the Z-axis for a total depth of 15 inches. The trick for this was to figure out what I wanted my table to look like on both sides. You could call it my two outside slices. And then, with a bit of trial and error, figure out the material that would go in between to help transition the shape properly from one outside slice to the other. Now, to double check that I had enough material in each slice to properly create that transition, I also created a profile view of what it would look like, which helped confirm my designs would be adequate. Once I had locked in my design, I could take the individual dimensions of each of my pieces, color code them based on their length. For example, a piece 5 inches long was color coded as red, and then translate those colored pieces into rough dimensional lumber. The final result was me needing 20 board feet of wood, which would be cut in half to form two 10-foot boards that then could be cut further into 8 total strips that would be 3 inches wide each and 10 feet long. Now that I have my designs, I hit up my local hardware dealer to purchase the lumber. Local dealers are great because they often have all the machinery to deliver on custom orders for wood, which was what I did for my project because I don't have the larger tools to mill lumber. And finally, we were on to assembly. I highly recommend posting your plans up on the wall for easy access, as I was frequently referencing mine during this stage. Now, I won't bore you with all the cuts, but based on my final number of pieces, I ended up making about 150 of them, which actually goes by relatively quickly if you can set up a stop block. Next up, I could begin laminating my pieces together, and to do this, I first laid out my first layer and confirmed it against my design. And then one by one, I glued up my pieces. A tip I picked up through Lumberjocks was to use an old credit card to evenly spread out glue. It worked incredibly well, and I recommend it for any glue up. Now for clamping up, I didn't want to use any finish nails to hold this in place while it dried, as I didn't want to end up hitting one of them when I went to carve this down later. So to avoid slipping, I took the clamp up slowly, keeping things flat in the process and slowly tightening in small and controlled increments. I then repeated this process over the course of the next 48 hours, gluing up all of my sections of my 5 slices. Next, to stack laminate them, I needed to clean up the outside surfaces in between each piece to make sure that when I glued them up, they would be flush. And even though I kept things flat in my first round of gluing up, it still wasn't nearly enough to avoid this step in the process. I had never used a stationary belt sander before, but this thing made cleanup of all the surfaces quick and painless, and you can see the result here after, much better. Then it was back to gluing up, and I took this one layer at a time. I don't recommend trying to do multiple layer glue ups at once, as it will undoubtedly slip, and you'll end up with pieces out of line, throwing off your whole project. And keep your design reference close by to double check you're doing everything correctly. Again, you've already put in a lot of work here, no need to rush. Same with clamping. take it slow and in small increments, and you'll be just fine. I could then go ahead and repeat this process for layers 3, 4, and 5, allowing at least 12 hours to dry in between each round. While my last glue up dried, I took to gluing up the top portion of my table. I laid out the 5 23-inch pieces I had cut up earlier. I found the arrangement of the grain that I liked best and glued everything up. Pretty simple and straightforward. And just make sure to use clamps on both the top and the bottom. This will help avoid any bowing while it dries. Now it was on to the fun part. My final glue up was completely dried and it was time to carve. And the way I'd be doing that is with this. This is Arbortech's Turbo Plane Blade, which is the coolest thing ever. The guys at Arbortech were super cool to send me one of these things, and I am so excited to get to work with it. This thing fits on any 4.5-inch or 4-inch angle grinder that you have. It comes with all the hardware that you need, and it's a universal tool that you can use for flattening, finishing, shaping, or creating profiles on any of the work that you have. I will leave a link in the description to this specific product as well as their website. That way you guys can check out all the other awesome things that they make. Now it's time to get to work. I'm actually really excited about this. This tool is a beast. It can remove a heck of a lot of material very quickly. Here's a slow-mo shot of it in action, and you can see how it carves away the wood pretty efficiently. However, take it slow. The Turbo Plane is very efficient at shaping, but carving away with this tool was a massive process and one that turned out to be way more work than I expected. And it was incredibly messy. I also advise having a good angle grinder for this, as well as wearing gloves, using a full face mask, wearing a long sleeve shirt, and using ear protection. And here is the rough shape after 5 hours of carving. The key to flattening this thing out properly before final finishing was using a 40 grit flap disc on my angle grinder. Once I'd flattened everything out and roughly contoured the piece, I switched to my orbital sander at 120 grit, which proved very effective in actually rounding out all of the corners to make it look like each section of the build flowed into the next one. And just to summarize, after carving with the Turbo Plane, the steps I took that worked to actually flatten this thing out and contour it and smooth it included a 40 grit flap disc, orbital and hand sanding at 120 and 220 grit, and then both a dry and wet sanding at 320 grit. Next, I could finish my top. I cleaned up and flattened it on my stationary belt sander and then measured and cut to my final length of 21 inches. And I didn't have a clamp on hand to create a makeshift straight edge, so I'm just freehanding the cut here, which wasn't an issue as I could clean it up quickly on the sander again. I also chose to use a 1/2 inch round over bit on the underside of the table to give it a bit more of a sleek looking profile. It was the first time I ever used a router for a build, and they really are as easy to use as everyone makes them out to be. Just take it slow for your first time. Then on to the final sanding at 120 and 220 grit with a final 320 grit dry and wet sanding. Now again, a wet sanding is always a good step as it will raise the grain further on your piece and make it so that when you do apply a finish, the grain will remain smooth. Last up, I could finish this project, and I'm using my favorite go-to-finish Danish oil to bring out the grain on this beast. And it really is the most satisfying thing to see all of your hard work come to life in this stage. Danish oil to me is the best as it soaks into the wood but doesn't sit on top of it, so you can still feel the grain of the woods once it cures. And finally, I was done. And it's crazy to see the transition from the stacked glue up to its final form. This project is so cool with its flowing curves and its thin and sleek profile, and it is especially neat to see all of the transition of the edge grain to the end grain, and I couldn't be more thrilled with the final form. Now I have this wooden tabletop, and after finishing it and actually sitting it on top of the table and looking at it, I like it, but I don't love it. And after having a few people who saw me work on this suggest that I use a glass top, I think that's what I'm actually going to go with. I mean, the point is to be able to show off this awesome design. I just don't have a glass tabletop to put on it yet, so for now I think I'm just going to find a temporary way to attach this to it, maybe through Velcro. And then when I get glass at a later time, I can just swap it out and then find another cool use for this tabletop. 3 quick things I want to leave you with. First, the Arbortech Turbo Plane is an incredible tool, so my hat's off to Arbortech for creating something awesome, and thank you again for sending it to me. However, as somebody who was new to using it and hadn't worked with angle grinders or done a lot of power carving in my life, it really helped having that flat disc in order to help actually flatten things out. Now, the Turbo Plane again can do a lot of that, but because of the tight space that I was working in, I found it difficult to actually maneuver it in a way where I was efficient in actually smoothing and flattening this thing out. 2, these things have a sizing threshold, and what I mean by that is that you really can't make it much smaller than what I made it here. And the reason being is that you need to be able to get your angle grinder into a lot of these gaps, and if you were to make it any smaller, it simply wouldn't be able to fit. And 3, and I think you guys can tell from the video, these things take forever. This was hundreds of cuts, multiple rounds of glue ups, and 10 plus hours of carving and finishing. So just keep that in mind. I think it was definitely worth it. I'm super excited with how it came out. I think it looks fantastic and I'm really excited about it, but it is a heck of a project to take on, so just be aware of that. Thanks so much for watching the video, guys. If you did enjoy it, let me know by hitting that like button. If you really enjoyed the video, I would love it if you would subscribe to the channel. That way you guys can stick around for any future uploads, as well as check out some of the projects that I worked on in the past. That'll do it for this week's episode, guys. I'll see you guys next time on the cutting board.